You're listening to the Replatform podcast sponsored by Amplience, an API-first headless CMS and DAM. Replatform was partnered with Amplience in 2022 to bring their wealth of industry knowledge and experience to our audience, gives us a fresh perspective on e-commerce technology and customer experience from a strong voice in the headless commerce community. Today, you have the unbridled joy even of listening to me, James Gedd, and my co-host Paul Rogers. How are you, mate?
Yeah, good. I think this is the first one we've recorded this year, right?
Yes, because the first release of 2022 we recorded in December to get ahead of ourselves. It is. It's a new bright year. How has the year started for you and Vivon?
Mental.
Same as last year then.
Yeah, I was expecting to have a really nice, easy start to the year, and everything's just gone crazy. And I feel like, I'm being chased left, right, and centre, and just loads of things going on. But I think on some level it's a good thing. What about you?
Yeah, well, this week was a week of planning and not earning, ready for next week's chaos to start. So let battle commence. And it's a new calendar for us for content for Replatform. And Happy New Year to our regular listeners. Thanks for tuning back in, and a warm welcome if you're joining us for the first time. We hope we don't put you off. A world of ecom wonder awaits. Do subscribe to get episode alerts, and we'd love you to like us on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple to satisfy our fragile egos. So let's do a TLDR of what we'll cover today. So the topic is, when do you need to replatform and what justifies the investment and effort? The key things we're going to cover is valid reasons to replatform, building the business case for investment, and scenarios when a company has to pivot and throw away an existing migration to something else. So that's quite an interesting one. Does that set it up well enough, do you reckon, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's lots of little subtopics, but yeah, perfect.
Cool. I'm sure we'll meander down side paths as well, as we usually do. So let's start. Question one is, what are the justifiable reasons why a business needs to replatform? So I'll kick off, and then we're just going to go to and fro on common reasons and valid reasons this is. So number one is total cost of ownership. This often seems to be a key driver, where the cost in terms of percentage of GMV or in terms of the amount of spend of CapEx and OpEx is prohibitive to what the business is able to or willing to spend, and it's unsustainable, and that's increasing. So even though the revenue might be increasing, the percentage share of the GMV is not coming down as it should do over the lifetime. So cost is often one of the key drivers why financial teams and e-commerce teams start to look and reconsider their options.
Yeah, and then so I'll go with another one. And I think this is the one that I'm seeing the most, to be honest, is agility. And I feel like a lot of brands that kind of maybe aren't on these SaaS platforms in particular are just frustrated where other brands or their competitors are kind of moving faster or introducing new features via kind of third parties that don't exist in their ecosystem. And I think your point on cost as well, same principle. I had a call yesterday with someone that is spending a lot of money on their online store, but actually they don't care about the expense. It's more what they're spending that money on. And it's entirely focused on upgrades, maintenance, discussions around integrations that probably don't need that level of discussion. And it's just very little. A very small proportion of their budget is going into new features and optimization and improvements, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, I have a client where the cost of doing, they can do stuff on the platform because the vendor's flexible. They've got a development team. It's a proprietary system. It's not done through agencies. But the issue isn't ability to do it. It's the time to get what should be just a simple, well, we have a pre-existing connector. Let's turn it on and do some configuration in the back end. And that is maybe a day's work to get that up and running versus this is a 1 week project. It's £4,000 cost rather than £1,000. Yeah. And then when you apply that across all of the elements in a roadmap that a client wants to push through, suddenly what should be Q1 takes you into Q2 and Q3. So yeah, exactly. Agility is a really good point, and the cost associated with that. And often the other cost with that in a platform is if you have a platform where it's not so simple to just turn things on because they're pre-built and pre-proven. So you take apps within BigCommerce, Shopify, even in Shopware's ecosystem, where actually the pre-development and QA work's been done at the code level. So when you turn it on, you're not having to do extensive QA of it because it's a proven additional feature. Having to do all of the QA, you pay more to the development unit testing, you pay more on your own UAT, and actually that slows you down in terms of where you're focusing your time and effort. And then I think linked to that, another important one is you've referenced earlier, the limited ecosystem, where they don't have the same level of partnerships with third parties, and that can be either development partners or feature providers, where you suddenly have to go and do a proper scoping project in order to get a capability turned on, because there aren't 3 or 4 existing partners in that ecosystem.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the majority of the reasons can be linked probably back to ecosystem and cost. I think the other one, on what you just said about the app piece and like stability and everything else, I think another like a really good example of that is like with the SaaS platforms, where they've got their standardized payment options, which are available via configuration options, all pre-built, pre-made, like maintained at platform level. I think that versus paying 50 grand to move payment provider on some of these other platforms is another big kind of example of some of these things we've already talked about. Another one, so maintenance, patches, upgrades, the amount of time and effort on both sides for deployment, all of that kind of stuff. Again, probably one of the biggest ones for me. And I think the most common conversation I've had that's resulted in a replatform recently is 2 things. So one is all of those costs, looking at it, bundling it together, maybe with a few additional features. Suddenly you've got 100, 150 grand, let's replatform. And that's the business case. Or the other one is unexpected costs. So, you've got a 20K earmarked for an upgrade, and actually suddenly the agency says it's 60K. And actually that's kind of the frustration that then leads to a replatforming project. And I think that kind of like building of an equal CapEx project, or at least justifying a large proportion of it, and then looking at a 3-year cost model. I think that's kind of typically where I see a lot of people moving, particularly to the SaaS platforms at the moment.
Yeah, and that upgrade one's interesting. So I've got a friend who's a program director, project lead, and he works with one of the big, I guess they're still called monolith platforms, but the legacy platforms, I'm not going to name them, but they have a client who's a massive, 200 million plus complex retailer, B2B, B2C, international. Yeah. And when they move from the old version to the new major version, it's taken 12 months to finish the upgrade, and it's been £1 million plus, because it's not a separated application layer and front end. All of the logic that sits in the back end has had to be updated, because the system that they've created is so heavily customized, and it's taken ages, and the amount of development resource in-house to manage that and do all of the release management, the testing, and it's slowed them down for the business in terms of what they can release incremental new functionality, because they've had to get all the core existing stuff stable in the new version before they can release the new features. And you realize actually when legacy systems say, yes, we've got a headless capability, but actually the logic layer is not separated, and therefore anything you've built on top of the logic layer, you have to then redo it when the underlying logic changes in a new release.
Yeah, I actually had a very similar conversation before Christmas, where someone was on one of those more enterprise monolithic platforms, and it would have cost more to upgrade from their older version to the new kind of cloud-based, more agile, ecosystem-oriented version, which I don't believe is the case, to Ecommerce tools, or it would have been 5-10 times more than a big commerce Shopify kind of project. And same principle. And I think it's probably going to be a lot of those around actually in the next kind of year or so as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is a really important point, isn't it? Is if you're on legacy, no matter how much modernization you've done in your stack and how much customization you've done, each time that legacy system has a major release, it's not a simple update. It's a major project, and you need to do risk assessment, and you need to treat it as a separate project which has a cost stream to it, and that can slow you down internally. That is often, as you've referenced, the tipping point for saying, actually, we really should consider our platform options now. Is this still the right technology? If we're going to spend 500 grand on this and it's going to take us 6 months, are we better spending 500 grand on a new platform and getting that more modern tech stack straight away? Another good example I've got is closed systems, where there are certain platforms that have been provided to the market from a retailer who's developed their own enterprise systems and has done very, very well and been successful. They've then turned themselves into a service company, in the way that Amazon did. But it's a closed system. and you can't customize it, you can't it doesn't have that separation of the API layer and the extensibility where you can create a custom version. You're on an instance and you are dependent on their roadmap and their release cycle for added functionality, and you can't influence it that heavily. So say, for example, you suddenly decide you want Algolia or Klaviyo as your search and merch tool, but that's not what they use in their platform. You can't just get it requested as a project, implement it on your instance. That has to go through their internal development evaluation to determine whether it's the right thing for their overall platform, which is normally biased by what's right for their business model. And it can lead to a lot of frustrations where people can't use the technology they want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my next one, and this is a bit of a smaller one, I guess, but again, I have this conversation a lot more, and I'm actually going to combine it with another one, but I guess one, simplifying. So, they want to maintain less. They want to be responsible for less as a business. They want more SaaS tooling that is kind of readily available, provided as a service, and is constantly improving. So like a tech stack essentially built up of that, and they want to kind of essentially build out a tech stack in a more modern way. Where kind of things are connected, you can kind of improve different things along the way, or like I said, SaaS products that are improving along the way, etc. And I think the other one that's kind of like slightly connected to that is because of the control aspect, is the ability to do more internally that isn't technology related. So either kind of owning different parts of the platform or even development, actually, like taking development in-house. That's a big trend in the SaaS space. And I think, suddenly you're worrying more about front end and less about back end. We've talked a lot about in-housing development, and it's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's easier with the SaaS platform, certainly, than it is with some of the more complex monolithic platforms. And, when you have to think about hosted infrastructure and everything else. So that's another big trend and another thing that's kind of driven replatforming projects as well. Yeah,
that's a good point. And it aligns with one of the areas I was thinking about, which is alignment with technical and business principles. So often when I sit down in projects, the starting point is to say, what are your business and technology principles? What do you believe in? What don't you believe in? How do you want to work and why? And does your current platform align with that, or is it providing barriers? And are those barriers prohibiting your strategic goals? A good example is I had one premium fashion brand, and they were working with a solution that open source. It had been customized, but to achieve the functionality set they wanted, they had over 30 third parties that were plugged in, and some of them were point-to-point integrations, others were using API, some were just like hacked in and therefore not very stable. Some of those third parties, then the third party stopped trading, so they had to swap it out and work out how to manage that project. It wasn't in an ecosystem where it was plug and play and easy transferable. You had upgrade challenges where third party updates their product. It then has to go through a project in itself to assess the upgrade version, do that development work, do the testing. And it was they realized that their web ops team were just spending all their time managing relationships with third parties and not doing anything proactive. So their technology and business principle going into platform assessment was, we need an ecosystem where we don't have that replicated and we can focus on trading and growth and not on just making sure that these plugins work. So sometimes that whole kind of operational piece of how do we want to work can make a current platform that you've got not fit for purpose, or it might be that the platform's fine, but the way the solution's been designed is not right and you need to change that, and that might mean shifting partners.
Yeah, and I think alongside that, I've had two conversations recently where like an internal team's become a big part of that, where like this kind of complicated like systems kind of architecture approach, like the way that everything works is kind of intertwined between agencies, third-party products, and the internal team. And there's a project that I'm kind of loosely working on, which is essentially taking a very complex, big bespoke implementation with a particularly complex ERP integration. It's not this whole thing that just can't move, and putting in, like a Soligo or equivalent Shopify or a big commerce, like just simplifying the whole piece, and the whole process is geared around everything needs to have standardized, well documented APIs. Just simplify the whole thing. It's that same point I said before, but I think from a technical perspective, your point is definitely really relevant.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. In one of the clients I worked with a few years back, the trigger for evaluating an e-commerce platform wasn't an e-commerce trigger. It was a back office trigger. So the business was changing ERP and introducing middleware. So similar to Celigo and iPass layer. And the current platform they had didn't have any existing projects where that integration had been done. There were no clients using either point-to-point or through middleware, that ERP. And that was perceived as a big risk because of the nature of ERP integrations. I mean, they are massive projects in their own right, and often cause lots of unforeseen headaches. So that then triggered a reevaluation of, well, actually, is the issue the e-commerce platform? We've got to move to this ERP. It's a global solution we're putting in. That's the most important system for the business because of all of its touch points. And that then led them to relook at the market and go and find where there was people with experience of integrating platforms and which platforms had the best proven deep connections into that ERP.
I think that actually is relevant to a point we haven't discussed, which I think we'd both see a lot of as well, which is big business change, investing loads of money in something. Let's review other parts of the business at the same time. It's a bit of a transformation project, or we're investing all this money over here. Actually, the e-com platform is really important. Let's look at that as well. I think that's quite often another reason why people look at replatforming, or it's more like investing in the e-com platform or channel, I guess.
Yeah, and one more that I guess it's less critical than some of the ones we talked about, especially less critical things like cost of ownership and overall solution design, but the admin tooling that the business teams have access to in order to do day-to-day management of the website, catalog management, updates, removals, trading, merchandising, you name it. I've worked with a few clients where they were on an old vendor, not one of the market leaders that you'd seen like the Gartner Quadrants and Forrester Waves. Really nice platform, lots of features, but the admin tooling was so convoluted to do anything. So setting up a new promotion, that wasn't like a half-hour job like you'll see in some, if you go into the back end of a Shopware, a Shopify, a BigCommerce, etc. It was taking them up to half a day to set up a simple promotion because they had to go through one part of the system to create a new promotion. Then they had to go through another part of the admin to set up the promotion code to attach to it. Then they had to go to the developers to actually enable that so that it was live and functioning. And by the end of that, you've lost half a day setting up a basic promotion code. And if you're trying to do it every time, if you are a discount driven retailer, which a lot of high street is, oh my God, you've just lost a shed load of working time doing basic things that should take a matter of minutes to do. And that was one of the drivers. It's well, actually, the opportunity cost for us of staying on this system is X £1,000s, which is in the tens of thousands of pounds per year in lost time and effort. Yeah. Anything else we missed? Any other key reasons on projects you've worked on and clients you've worked with of why they start to look at a replatform and a justifiable reason to do so?
I think not necessarily justifiable, and this ties into a lot of what we've talked about because the rationale would probably be driven by a lot of what we talked about. But I think new team or team member is a big reason quite often as well. Like I've had clients where the business is actually perfectly fine on a Magento or any platform, but actually the person's come in and said, last brand I worked at grew from 1 to 50 million in a year on Shopify, therefore we need to go and move to Shopify, or all of this stuff's going to be much easier in BigCommerce or whatever else. I think that's another reason, not necessarily always the right reason.
That's my question. Is it okay? Yeah. Let's pick this apart because sometimes it is justified. What would make that a justifiable reason? What evidence is required?
All the stuff that we talked about, really. I think, they need to show a cost benefit or a functional benefit or
exactly.
efficiency benefits. And I think before this, we talked about a potential episode in the future, which was, I said there was an example of someone I spoke to that was on Shopify, got sold the dream, like perfectly happy, growing, doing really well as a business, good like brand experience, etc. Got sold the dream of Magento by another agency because they mentioned the word internationalization. Spent all this money moving to Magento, tiny team, wasn't really the right fit. And then now they're probably going to have to write it off and go back to Shopify, or like that's on the table. And, you know, that was an example of someone going to the CEO and selling the dream. And I think that also happens quite a lot as well.
Yeah, exactly. The panacea for all your business woes is to move technology, whereas the issues aren't always technology based, they're often process. I think that's an important thing, is when we talk about justifiable in this episode, it's not just, oh, well, Shopify can do this better, or BigCommerce does this, or Salesforce does this. It's what are the current business issues? What are the impediments to growth? What are the goals and strategic aims where a different type of technology gives you an affordable way of achieving that quicker, better, more efficiently, etc. And that's what justification is. And it's fine. Yeah, you're right. It's fine if somebody comes in with experience from another business of having gone through that transformation and can articulate that in the context of the current business. And that is, you don't have to go through a selection process if you've already got a solid business case, and you can save yourself a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so on to your next point, which is kind of very relevant to this. I think it's there's a few variables. And I think as long as it's, you know, there's a justifiable argument, timing, I think, is really important as well. Is it a good time for a business to make a big change, etc.? I think that is really important. Your next point, which I touched on, was I've kind of interrupted you and just gone AWOL here a little bit. But in terms of kind of sunk projects and a time where, like, when it's sometimes good to just like write off a project, I think that's a really interesting one, because I see that a lot at the moment as well, where people have invested loads of money. One, I think there's been loads of change in platforms recently. Like what would have been considered optimal, best in class, modern 2-3 years ago is definitely not going to be the same now, because I think there's more noise about these simplified SaaS platforms, or potentially slightly more simplified headless builds than maybe what people were talking about a couple of years ago. But I've definitely seen examples of where people have gone into this kind of enterprise stack. Realistically, the mistake was that they hadn't thought about what they needed enough, and the pros and cons of different approaches and platforms and everything else. And they've just gone and said, you know, this is enterprise, it will scale, therefore we'll put our money into this. And actually it doesn't align with the team. Project hasn't been planned properly. They don't have the resource internally to even scope or like work with an agency to really scope it out properly. And like, there's one example I have in my head where they decided to go with this, API first platform, and then build out this really complicated technology stack. And then well into the hundreds of thousands, they wrote it off, and now they're moving to a SaaS platform. And I think that is going to be quite a common thing that we'll see over the next year or two as well, where I think for a while it was seen that the SaaS platforms were too small and they probably couldn't scale endlessly. And then you've got the ones in the middle that are probably not necessarily as modern. People don't necessarily believe in the vision. Lots of horror stories flying around. And then you had this like dream approach, which was API first, best of breed, like microservices, like build something that ultimately will scale, but it's probably not necessarily aligned with some of the SMBs that have gone down that route. And I think that would be an interesting one we'll see now, is people kind of essentially building these like massive CapEx projects and then backing out of them.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. Why do some businesses write off projects and pivot to an alternative? And is it justifiable, or is it knee-jerk? And I've got a point related to that, actually, because you've been talking about underestimating complexity and the cost and the time frame, and suddenly what was a 6-month project to replicate as is in a new modern composable stack or headless stack, or however you want to call it, is now 12 months in, is 500 grand over budget. They can't get the right resources in. It's stagnating. It's losing internal buy-in. And I've seen this in a large fashion brand. and I've seen it in other businesses too. And the issue is always poor project structure.
Yeah.
So, one example I've seen where a technology decision was made by an IT team to go down a particular route with a particular vendor and a particular architecture. But that technology decision was made in isolation of the business functions. So there was no consultation from an operational model and strategic point of view for e-commerce and digital. It was about technology principle. And businesses don't exist as technology principles or just business for two work together. And technology is the enabler of the business vision. And that getting that wrong meant that you didn't have the right stakeholder set. You didn't have the right project definition. The technology could have potentially been the right fit if it had been scoped correctly and the solution design was aligned with business need. What it ended up with is a first release of a product which has no meaningful admin function for business users to do what they're used to doing. They start going, well, where do I create my campaigns? How do I set up my merchandising rules? How do I go and change my sort order here? And all the stuff you just get in an e-commerce an off-the-shelf mature e-commerce platform. Often this is what screws it up. And then the cost of fixing that is way more expensive than saying, bin it, pivot, go to a proven platform.
Yeah, I think 9 times out of 10, this stuff will come down to, the client making a poorly informed decision or not being diligent enough. And the thing is, I guess the client will always argue they shouldn't need to do that if they work with the right setup in terms of providers. But I think this is where, and this is probably all of our episodes, or at least half, come down to this, which is if you're going into a replatforming project as a business, you need to be super diligent and you need to do your kind of research, make sure that you're bringing in the right people to tell you how much planning needs to be done. Because we had another client who are pretty big, they've got a really small ecom team, very non-technical. For some reason they made this decision independently to move all of their European sites to what is a very new bleeding edge platform. From a bespoke platform, went live 12-14 months later. Should have been a 3-month project. A month later they had to roll back just because so many of the business processes just weren't considered, and they were trying to kind of work with it and everything else, but it just had too much of a hit on other departments, and they had to roll it back and write off the project. And they'll probably go and look at replatforming again in a year. But I think almost all of it comes down to that initial phase, probably pre-SI phase, where you just need to get your kind of ducks in a row. And I think broadly.
Yeah, it going down a route of changing technology has an impact across the business, and all those touch points have to be understood and the right stakeholders consulted to come up with an optimum view. Because what MVP means to an IT team is different to what it means to a business team. And then it needs to have a level of oversight and governance to be able to tie the two together to create what is an acceptable scope, and then make sure everyone buys into that process. But linked to that, one of the reasons I've seen a project be burned and an executive team say, right, we're writing it off, which unfortunately sometimes means people lose job roles as a result of it, which is horrible. But one of the reasons is the project, as you flagged earlier, the complexity spiraling and it moving them away from what they're focused on and diverting from what their core strategy is. So they become a technology company rather than a retailer. And the executive team don't want to be a technology company. Suddenly that engineering function has had to go from 5 people to 15 people. And to achieve what they needed to, that needs another 5-10 people over the next 12 months. You suddenly see the cost of that side of business dwarf what license fees and support fees would be if you took an off-the-shelf, whether it's SaaS or whatever, whether it's a Magento, solution. And the executive team make that call and say that we're losing our strategic focus, and that's to the detriment of the overall business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that probably ties up that one.
Yeah. Is there anything else you've seen where there is why people have written off projects and swallowed that cost from a justifiable point of view? Anything else we've missed?
I think that same point around new people and bias and, maybe stakeholders not being bought in and just continually creating reasons to write projects off. I think that whole internal piece is another one. I also think sometimes, like, because I think there's almost like two types of businesses in my head when we do these episodes. You've got the smaller ones where it's an easier decision to go to the SaaS platforms and you maybe need a bit less preparation. And then the bigger projects where it's a much bigger decision and there's a lot more stakeholders and a lot more factors at play. And I think with the bigger ones, sometimes those projects will take years. And I think sometimes you'll get to a certain point and actually it's like, okay, shit, we went down this, or I probably shouldn't swear on the podcast, but or we've gone.
Let's make 2022 the year of swearing on the podcast.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, but yes, we've gone down this route. We've had to because of all these reasons. And actually, these platforms over here, which would have been much better for us, have now suddenly introduced all these features or fixed all these issues, and now they're the right route. And
right.
Yeah, I think that's another one that I've seen a bit. If it's a 2-year build and suddenly there's been a huge amount of improvement in these other off-the-shelf platforms and a massive amount of pain going through the build with this more complex technology stack.
Yeah, and one other last one for me actually, and I've seen it with one of the clients I work with, was a change in either ownership, or so it could be a change in financial ownership, like VCs coming in with a different strategic vision, or it could be a shift at board level in terms of strategic focus for the business. So the business is at an e-commerce level has decided to move, and I had one who were moving from an old platform to one of the more modern SaaS platforms. But then the business strategy shifted to be more trade focused, B2B, and less on the retail. The retail growth had planned to be about 70% of the growth. Then it switched to trade. Now, all of a sudden, that changed the focus because the platform that they were planning to switch to, and they had already had a project and they were already at the point of signing contracts and had spent time and effort on discovery, etc. So not a massive amount of money, but still cash spent, tens of thousands. Well, that platform wasn't best in breed for trade, and they had some more advanced requirements around things like multi-user accounts, tiered accounts, tier pricing, volume discounts, tax and duty handling, curated catalog management, all of that jazz that suddenly makes us a B2B focused platform far more suitable and less costly because of the amount of effort to customize. They didn't want multiple platforms. They wanted one platform to do both trade and retail. And then that meant that project focus being shifted. So sometimes it is strategic changes. Some of those are preventable and others are not. That's just the way business evolves.
I would say that's a huge trend at the moment. Actually, that's a really good point. So 3 of our clients have acquired new companies in the last 3 months. We've had other clients that are like either taken investment from a private equity firm or VC or whatever, and then others that are like looking at being part of a roll up, etc. And all of those have had some level of, I think, all of the parent organizations have dictated the platform or wanted to. Like a lot of private equity firms nowadays will have some level of agreement with a Shopify or some of the big platform companies, and all of the brands will go into it. A lot of organizations will have a multi-brand Magento implementation, and they'll just pull people in, use the kind of theme structure, use the whole kind of back end setup, and then just like essentially style it in line with brand, etc. Like and same with Salesforce. Salesforce have a lot of like groups under them. And I think that's actually massive. That is actually such a really topical one at the moment because there's just so much M&A in the e-com space.
Yeah, good point. Let's move on to our third and final question. How do you build a business case for change? So regardless of what's driving the change, how do you build a business case for investment and validate that there's a reason for doing this?
So I think we probably already answered this in a way. From my perspective, I think usually people will try and demonstrate a saving over a period of time by migrating and then also showing additional benefit. Sometimes it would be if someone's got specific goals in terms of features, functionality, growing D2C, etc., trying to demonstrate how things would be delivered faster on another platform. Other times it might be like specific business goals like internationalization or whatever else and kind of justifying it via that. They're probably my biggest ones, with cost being the most common.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. And it's getting a detailed understanding of cost model. Often people don't think enough about the cost model as it is and the cost models as it will be, and comparing where they might have new costs to think about and where they might be able to avoid costs in the future. So a few examples of that is you've got license fees. You might be moving from license fee to non-license. I've seen this where cost model for Magento investment was based on using open source and not having a license fee, and suddenly saving 80 grand a year from the existing one. That could be spent on additional development work that was needed to get the open source to where they need it to. But you then also got internal costs to use the platform. Like, how much time and effort does it take your team to do stuff currently on the current platform? And how much time and effort can you save because the new platform, it's got better admin tools, it's got better automation, it's set up better to deliver what the business needs, or it's got better third-party tools with pre-existing connectors that can save you time and effort doing things. All of this stuff, to achieve the functionality you need, how much time and effort is it one versus the other? It's a really important cost to think about, and too many people don't. They just look at the obvious cost. What's it cost to develop? What's the license fee? And what's the support maintenance?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I think the other one is, I think there's a lot of bundling. I see a lot of bundling to justify that, and maybe there's other projects going on in the business. It might be like a PIM as an example, or looking at integrations, everything else. And I think there's often a lot of opportunities within other projects that are happening to try, and where you've got expenses like the upgrades we've talked about, maintenance overheads, unexpectedly high costs for a project or a new feature, etc., and then pulling those together and building out a bigger project. I think I'm like a massive fan of building CapEx projects and just pulling loads of scope together, because I think it's more efficient in terms of like how you test, how things are released, everything else. And I think a lot of people try and do that quite often. I think it's easier to swallow if the cost is part of a bigger overall cost.
Yeah, I also like looking at the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost of not moving. If you have inefficiency, for example, that client I referenced earlier who's on an old proprietary system, and to do simple things like adding marketing tracking tags, which, God, you should be able to do it yourself. You should be able to drop those into a site without requiring development. They wanted to add certain third-party tracking tags. It was going to cost them a few £1,000s, which was crazy. So you look at all of those. You look at your roadmap for the next 12 to 24 months. Look at everything where you can't self-serve, and you look at what you could self-serve on and what the cost of doing it in the existing one is. And it's amazing. I've done this for some projects where suddenly you identify 20 to 30 grand's worth of cost per year for doing things that you should be able to do with your own time or at a much reduced cost. And all of a sudden you find there's a big cost saving in there, which helps you with your business case. And also there is an emotional business case. So there's the financial one that needs validated, so it gets signed off by the executive team and the financial director. But there's also the emotional one of your team. Will the new platform give your team a better set of tools so that they can be more effective, more efficient, happier? You can give them better job enjoyment, which means hopefully they'll stay for longer, and you get a better, more productive e-commerce environment focused on positive outcomes. It's hard to put a number to that, but you can certainly put an emotional value. And that's equally as important, because you want your e-commerce team functional, efficient, and happy.
Yeah, I think the other trend that I've seen recently, which is not a good one, is people recruiting senior e-com managers, head of e-coms, and actually they don't want to work with certain technology stacks. And I've had jobs where I've said to people, this could be a really good fit for you, and they don't want to work with the technologies, which is not going to be super common, but it's certainly like if you go into a job as a head of e-com, you want to be able to do stuff quickly and grow revenue in particular. And I think that platforms and technology stack probably does tie into that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, it links with some of the other points you made earlier, which is if the business is deciding to build out its own internal engineering function and wanting to control more elements like front-end development, the whole UX layer, doing that where there is a rich pool of developers with experience of that technology out there is going to be a lot easier for you to achieve that goal than if you are on a platform where actually it's such a closed community that you're going to very quickly exhaust the ability to get junior, mid, senior developers. So really, really good point about that is is, do you have a technology with an ecosystem that gives you the resource that you need and want?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else we've missed? I'm trying to think of the other things about building a business case for change. Money and return on investment is clearly number one. Operational efficiency and ability to execute against your strategy is number two. Efficiency and tooling for e-commerce teams so that they actually have a job they can do and enjoy and focus on value add, 3. And then the ecosystem and capability in alignment with your what you're trying to achieve as a business, number 4. Anything else?
No, I think that 4th one probably covered a lot. I was just thinking about ones where maybe you've got like you're trying to achieve a more complex, subscription flow or like order management capability or international, but I think that all falls into that like 4th one. But yeah, I think to me they're probably the underlying reason or the most common ones.
Yeah, cool. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. So hopefully it's been useful, giving people a bit of food for thought. We'd love to hear what your takes are. If you've got anything to add, have we missed anything? What are justifiable reasons why businesses need to replatform and do replatform? How do you build a business case? Please do, wherever you're listening or watching, add to the comments, message me and Paul on Twitter, LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. We don't think we know everything. We're always open to learning from other people. And thanks for listening. Keep an ear out for the next episode. They land every Tuesday. And let us know of any topics you'd love us to cover. But do tell us why so we understand the context for it. Subscribe if you haven't already. And we'd love a rating if you've liked this episode. And hopefully we'll see you all again next week for the next episode. For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.